It's impossible to imagine today, but in 2001, deep in the mountains and valleys that form the border between Kosovo and Serbia, a team of US Army Special Forces conducted a joint mission with Russian Spetsnaz and VDV paratroopers, marking the only time in history that the American operators worked with their Russian counterparts. This odd moment in history sees the two adversarial teams talking with each other about geopolitics over vodka and reacting to firefights in the streets. This occurred during a period of heightened tensions between the West and the post-Soviet Russian Federation. NATO had just intervened in the Bosnia and Kosovo Wars, which were areas that Russia viewed as within its sphere of influence. Just 2 years prior, in 1999, British and Norwegian troops had a tense standoff with Russian soldiers at the Pristina International Airport in Serbia. It almost escalated into an all-out firefight. Disaster was narrowly averted when the two sides reached an agreement where Russian troops would be part of the Kosovo Peacekeeping Force, known as KFOR, but would deploy and operate under their own command, independently of NATO leadership.
We
will work in close cooperation with NATO in order to fulfill our joint mission.
Russia had around 3,150 troops in Kosovo in their own zones, next to soldiers from NATO member states, including 5,500 US troops. To say things were tense among the peacekeeping forces in 2001 is a massive understatement. In this complex military and political environment of the Balkans, just after the war in Kosovo, a team of US Green Berets were assigned to help KFOR enforce the demilitarized zone between Kosovo and Serbia, called the Ground Safety Zone. This 5-kilometer wide area had been established by the Kumanova Agreement that ended the Kosovo War. The agreement was aimed at keeping the peace and protecting civilians, who had suffered immensely during the war in Kosovo. With military forces from multiple nations all operating in such close proximity, along with militias and paramilitary groups roaming the countryside, coordinating between the various components of KFOR was a major, ongoing challenge for the peacekeeping mission. To that end, in March of 2001, a team of Green Berets known as an Operational Detachment Alpha, or ODA, were sent to join a Russian force based out of the town of Kamencia as part of a 6-month-long liaison assignment. Working alongside foreign militaries and militias is a common mission for Green Berets, but for decades these assignments had been working against the Russians, not with them. One of the US special operators assigned to the mission, Mark Giaconia, wrote a memoir about his experience titled One Green Beret. It's an excellent book that you should definitely pick up. A lot of the information from this episode comes from it. It's full of insider perspectives of someone who served both before and after 9/11. In the Kosovo chapter, he describes the bizarre dynamic of first meeting the Russians they were supposed to work alongside for the better part of a year. Quote, "It was strange to me that I would be working jointly with the Russians in Kosovo after being taught in boot camp back in 1991 that killing Russians should be my primary goal in life." Mark's team replaced an ODA that had been on the same mission for the past 6 months, but the previous team had never gotten along well with the Russians due to the language barrier, and a long history of tension between the two countries. Fortunately, Mark's team leader had learned Russian at the Defense Language Institute, which gave the deployment a unique opportunity for former enemies to establish a rapport and work together. With the team leader acting as an interpreter, Mark and the ODA learned the Russian troops that were assigned to work there were actually a mix of Spetsnaz and VDV paratroopers. Spetsnaz is a broad term that refers to any of a variety of special forces detachments in the Russian military. GRU, GRU Military Intelligence, or FSB State Security Service, and Mark only ever got intentionally vague answers from the troops about which unit they belonged to. Yet despite their reputation, Mark describes the Russian troops to be similar to the thousands of soldiers he'd met in other militaries during his deployments. As the Americans and Russians patrolled and worked together, there were many opportunities to chat or share some vodka, sometimes too much vodka. Both sides were eager to impress the other about how much they could drink or how long they could last in a Russian sauna to prove who was truly the best. But according to Mark, along with the competitiveness came a certain common understanding between soldiers. This was over a decade after the Cold War had ended, and still many years before the invasion of Ukraine. So this brief moment in history might be one of the few rare chances Russian Spetsnaz and US forces would ever feel completely comfortable talking to each other. With a bottle of peppermint vodka between them one night, One of the Russians asked Mark if the United States was scared that the Soviet Union would launch a nuclear weapon at them in the 1980s during the Cold War. Mark said he was surprised by the bluntness of the question. He answered that he didn't think so. The Russian said he thought nuclear war was imminent because they'd nuked Japan, so why wouldn't they nuke Russia? I think it's interesting to hear the perspective of that Russian soldier because it shows just how far apart the two sides' understanding of each other really is. Candid moments between soldiers like that illustrated to Mark just how far away politics can be on the battlefield. A special talent of the Army Green Berets is establishing relationships and building alliances, even temporary ones. As the rapport between the Spetsnaz and Army Special Forces ODA deepened over the coming months, the Russians shared more details about their operations and brought the Green Berets along with them on more patrols. On one trip, the Russian colonel specifically invited the US captain to join him on a special visit. As the Russian jeep drove north for what seemed like ages, the US captain finally checked his GPS and realized they had driven all the way through the demilitarized zone and into Serbia itself, far out of the bounds from anywhere a US soldier should be. The reason this was a problem is because the US had run a bombing campaign through there 2 years prior, and so the team was under direct orders to stay out of Serbia. As the vehicle approached a Serbian military checkpoint, he was convinced they'd been set up and were about to be taken prisoner. He started whispering to his teammate about how they were going to throw grenades, run for it, and hope for the best. But what happened next completely surprised the captain and other Green Berets who'd come along on this little expedition. The Spetsnaz colonel got out of the jeep and praised the Green Berets to the Serbian commander, complimenting how well the Americans were helping them clamp down on the Albanian rebels in the region. Moments later, they were all gathered around a table drinking the traditional Balkan rackage of brandy and sharing stories about recent wars, how much they hated politicians, and the insanity of the Cold War. Quote, "Right there on the side of that dirt road in Serbia, where US troops weren't supposed to be, due to imminent danger and international agreements, a Russian Spetsnaz colonel and a couple of US Green Berets, and some Serbian soldiers, all sworn enemies at some point in recent history, sipped rakija." The impromptu drive into Serbia actually made life much easier for the Green Beret team. Not only did the Serbian commander share the location of recent UCPMB activity, but also spread the word to his comrades that the Americans were on their side. The UCPBM insurgents also got sloppy, terrified that the Americans and the Russians had joined forces with the Serbians to root them out. The official position of KFOR was just to keep the peace in the region, not take sides or hunt down paramilitary groups. But as the UCPMB faction's morale dropped, they also grew more desperate. Life for the Russians and Americans in Kosovo was about to get a lot rougher. It's worth parsing out the different factions that were here that the Green Berets and the Spetsnaz were dealing with. Serbia, who the US and Europe held responsible for starting the conflict, was barred from any military presence in the ground safety zone, aside from small, lightly armed police patrols. The other major combatant of the Kosovo War, the Albanian separatist Kosovo Liberation Army, had agreed to disarm and cooperated with the UN peacekeeping mission despite Kosovo not being granted independence from Serbia like they'd hoped for. Splinter groups that disagreed with the compromise broke off and started their own insurgencies in Kosovo, Serbia, and Macedonia. One of these splinter militias, the UCPMB, set up shop in the rugged terrain of the ground safety zone, where Serbian forces couldn't reach them. The UCPMB fought a guerrilla war against what they called an ongoing Serbian oppression, demanding that 3 regions of the southern Serbia with majority Albanian populations be recognized as part of Kosovo instead. At their peak, the UCPMB numbered around 1,500 strong. They equipped themselves with huge numbers of black market weapons that had circulated throughout the Balkans after the past decade of wars that had followed the breakup of the socialist Yugoslavia back in 1992. These attacks were a large part of what the peacekeeping forces were trying to stop because they threatened to undo the fragile peace treaty. Reading Mark's account of his personal understanding of the conflict in Kosovo is interesting because it shows insight into how part of the Special Forces' job is to become familiar with the history, culture, and perspectives of each faction. Kosovo was a province of Serbia, and a part of the patchwork of regions that made up the former Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia. Around 85% of the population of Kosovo were ethnic Albanians, who were predominantly Muslim thanks to the expansion of the Ottoman Empire into the Balkans in the 14th century. It's interesting to see how Mark describes his understanding of the conflict that he's thrown into the middle of, saying, quote, "Due to hundreds of years of ethnic, religious, and territorial disputes, there was plenty of man-made hate to go around. And of course, each side's politicians leveraged these factors and the media to further the divide. The Preševo Valley area that the UCPMB faction wanted to break away was mostly off limits to the Serbian military as a result of the ground safety zone, so it fell to the international KFOR and Russian peacekeeping mission to patrol that area, to stop the attacks and protect civilians. And that explains what happens next. Soon after the meeting, one of the splinter militia UCPMB snipers shot a Russian soldier on patrol. American choppers were called in for medevac and Kazovac duties, but the Russians had no way to call them in quickly. They had to route a request through their own command, all the way up to Russian headquarters, who then had to request the mission from NATO headquarters and all the way down the chain of command. Fortunately, the American Green Berets were right there in Kamencia, and the team were eager to go help a fallen soldier. After bouncing through the mountain terrain for an hour and a half, the joint Russian-American convoy reached the scene and called in a helicopter, but it was too late. The sniper had managed a headshot from over 800 meters away. There was no saving the Russian soldier, even if he'd been closer to Kamencia. It was an exceptionally skilled shot. Many of the UCPMB were veterans of the KLA and the Kosovo War, and so the shot seemed plausible to them at the time. Skilled adversary or not, the Russians were furious. They were out for blood now, determined to find the sniper who'd shot their comrade and bring him to justice. With a KFOR peacekeeper KIA, the American team were also enraged, and the next few days turned into an all-out manhunt through the entire Russian sector of the border zone. The Joint Task Force had a lucky break when they spotted a military-aged male walking down a random dirt road far from any village or town. A quick search of the area found his vehicle had stash of UCPMB equipment inside, directly linking him to the insurgents. The Russians apprehended the man and drove him back to a base at Kamencia. Mark's account of the interrogation doesn't say much, just that the Russians took the man behind one of the buildings, behind their side of the town, and the Green Berets didn't follow. An hour later, the Russians came back with an exact location of the insurgents' hideout, and the whole task force moved out. It must have been an odd sight seeing American Humvees and Russian BTRs together as they raced through the valleys of Kosovo. Mark was in the turret of one of the Humvees, manning the Mark 19 grenade launcher when they rolled up on the hideout's entrance in a remote forest called Velja Gava. Dense woods meant Mark and his team could only see a few meters ahead of them, while they followed some faint tire tracks in the mud. The intel from the man the Russians had interrogated said that there could be anywhere between 40 and 80 fighters in the camp, so they could be riding right into an ambush against a far larger force. But when the convoy rounded a bend, they saw a gate that read "Stop, UCPMB," along with a very surprised guard holding an AK-47. The Americans and Russians sprung into action. Two of the Green Berets got out of the lead Humvee and disarmed the surprised guard before opening the gate. At the same time, the Russian Spetsnaz troops jumped down from the roof of their BTRs and advanced through the woods to the left of the road. Mark's driver slowly advanced the Humvee past the gate, and he lost sight of the Russians in the dense trees and thickets. The UCPMB fighters had camouflaged their camp well, using branches and foliage to mask their tents and pathways from the air. No wonder the NATO jets and helicopters hadn't found the place. Mark estimated the camp covered around 4 to 5 acres, and the whole place was starting to come alive with motion and shouting. He couldn't see much through the thick forest, and his adrenaline surged as he heard gunshots up ahead. At first, Mark wasn't sure if it was incoming fire or the Russians doing their business, but as he heard the telltale snaps of bullets flying past his head and twigs falling around him, he wasn't any doubt which it was. Mark swung his Mark 19 in the general direction he thought the shots had come from. He still couldn't see anything, but if he didn't act now, he might not have a chance to regret it later. Mark thumbed the spade trigger on the Mark 19 and sent a volley of 40mm high-explosive grenades into the forest. The sound and concussions of the explosives in the tight trees of the forest encampment shook the air. Other members of Mark's team fired their small arms into the trees while Mark reloaded the mounted weapon. But in less than a minute, the team's captain called for them to cease fire and dismount. Mark grabbed an M240 machine gun and pressed out with his team to form a perimeter, but no fire came back at them through the smoke and pulverized trees ahead. Believe it or not, this was Mark's first combat action. It's hard to imagine that a Green Beret hadn't fired his weapon in combat for so long. The world was a very different place before 9/11. Actual combat was pretty rare even for special forces teams, and it was training combined with good leadership that kept Mark and his team organized as they took their first hostile fire. 20 minutes later, it was all over. The team searched the camp and confiscated a makeshift armory full of machine guns, landmines, mortars, and explosives. The Russian Spetsnaz and VDV troops emerged out of the woods, escorting 9 prisoners. Mark noticed that several of them had bullet and shrapnel wounds, likely from his barrage of 40mm grenades from the Mark 19, but the Russians commended Mark on his effective suppressive fire that allowed them to advance along the left flank. According to Mark's recollection of the Spetsnaz skills in the 2000s, he believed that they had intuition and instinct when it came to flanking and reconnaissance. He assessed that their marksmanship was good, and so too was their discipline. The changes in both the United States and Russian military over the next 20 years would be profound. Based on the intel gathered from the Velaya Galava camp, the Russians and Americans raided several more suspected UCPBM locations, but didn't find anything nearly as organized or equipped as the one they had in the first combat action. The insurgency itself only lasted a few more weeks before the UCPMB surrendered and gave up trying to turn the region over to Kosovo. KFOR, that Russia was a part of, also dissolved the ground safety zone, striking a new deal with Serbia to keep the region secure as another insurgency was brewing in neighboring Macedonia. Mark and his team couldn't be sure, but they liked to think that their joint operations with the Russians had broken the insurgents' will to fight, directly leading to some surrender and at least some measure of peace in this part of the Balkans. Keep in mind, this story is a recollection of one soldier's personal memories. He says some of the information might not be accurate. For instance, Mark had a conversation with a Russian soldier at the end of his tour that led him to believe that the death of the Russian soldier by a sniper had possibly been a hoax. It might have been another Russian soldier that murdered him, or an accidental discharge covered up. Mark believed that it might have been used as an excuse to justify combat operations against the UCPMB. I thought this unique story was a strange snapshot in history where 2 adversarial nations worked on the same side in a peacekeeping mission. But speaking of changing alliances, did you know that Russia and North Korea just signed a new defense treaty? It'll have major consequences for the world. Check out the video link in the corner of the screen, or there's a link for you in the description. Consider hitting the like button if you found the story interesting or if you learned something. Thank you, Spare Parts Army.